Hey up everyone, welcome back to my channel. I hope you're all well, you're staying inside and you're looking after yourself. So today I'm going to be doing an NRL rivalry video. Now I did an NRL rivalry video a couple of days ago and that went over all the rivalries and the ones that I thought were fierce, competitive, and I also did some forgotten rivalries, clubs that no longer play in the NRL. But tonight I'm going to be doing my first NRL rivalry in depth. So I'm going to be going from when the first clubs started playing against each other, the big moments, and going through why they don't like each other. So tonight I'm going to be doing South Sydney versus Eastern Suburbs or the Sydney Roosters. So whenever people talk about NRL rivalries, this one's always up the top of the list. This is always one of the first ones that people talk about when they talk about rivalries in rugby league. And I'd have to agree with them. I think it's one of the most fierce rivalries in the NRL, probably the most fierce. But tonight I'm just going to be going from DDoS, so when they first started playing against each other, all the way up until the present. Before I get into the video, I'd just like to say thank you to everyone that subscribed to my channel recently, and a big thank you to everyone that has continued to support me from the start. The channel's growing and I'm dead pleased with it. And also, if you got a spare moment, go over to Rugby League History. That's the Facebook page that I run. I'll put a link in the description below. Go and check that out if you love nostalgia, history, facts, trivia, all that keep it. So, South Sydney and Eastern Suburbs, they haven't liked each other. They've never liked each other since they first ever laid eyes upon each other, since they first ever played. So, the first thing I'm going to say about the rivalry is the head-to-head. So head-to-head, the two clubs since 1908 have played 246 matches against each other. South Sydney's won 126 of those matches, Eastern Suburbs 112, and there's been 8 draws. The first time that they ever played against each other was May the 16th, 1908, and Eastern Suburbs won that match 13 points to 12. In the same year, the two clubs played each other in the first ever grand final. So in 1908 they played against each other at the Royal Showground, which is now Fox Sports Studios in, you can see it's in Moore Park. They got the entertainment quarter there, all that keep it. South Sydney won that match 14-12, so South were the first premiers of the New South Wales Rugby League. Now, in the 1910s, the two clubs were particularly strong. They played each other in some big games. But the next grand final that they played against each other was the 1923 grand final, where Eastern Suburbs beat South Sydney 15 points to 12. And from the match report that I read, Eastern Suburbs scored a try in the final minute in the corner to win the match. So you could see that it was one apiece there, as well, if you go in the grand finals and all that. So the next grand final after that the two clubs played in was the 1928 grand final, where South Sydney got revenge on Eastern Suburbs, winning 26 points to 5. And back in those days that would have been a bit of a flogging, because try back then was worth 3 points. Then we go a couple of years forward, 1931. Now this was another grand final between South and Eastern Suburbs, and I guarantee you if there was cameras back then, if you had your smartphones and stuff back then, or you had television, all that keeper, I reckon this grand final would have been up there with the all-time great grand finals. The score was 7-all for most of the match. There was lots of spiteful play, a few injuries, and with time running out on the clock, with only a couple of minutes to go, South Sydney made a break through the field, and then South Sydney player Harry Ayers beat a few Eastern Suburbs players and scored under the post to win the match for South Sydney, 12 points to 7. In 1935 the two clubs met again. South Sydney were on a bit of a decline. A lot of their players had retired, but they still managed to meet the grand final with a weaker squad. Eastern Suburbs had the likes of Dave Brown, Ernie Norman, Rhys Day, people like that playing for them, and they won comfortably in that grand final, 19 points to 3. Then in 1948 the two clubs played against each other in South Sydney's first ever match at Redfern Oval in 1948, and the match finished in a 19-all draw. So South Sydney's first ever game at Redfern Oval was against Eastern Suburbs. Just going on my list here. It's quite a big list, I tell you. So then things were a bit quiet on the field over the next couple of years. South went through a very dominant era in the 1950s. Eastern Suburbs went on the decline. Going forward through the 1960s, Eastern Suburbs finished last a couple of times on the table. South went through another glory period. But then in the early 70s, one of South Sydney's favourite sons, Ron Coote, signed for Eastern Suburbs. This caused a huge boil over in the rugby league world, and especially on the South Sydney side. In the years to come, Ron Coote said that he was getting lots of angry letters in the mail. He said that some woman phoned him up claiming to be a gypsy, saying that she'd put a curse on him. And there was a family that said that they had a pet rabbit called Ron Coote, and when he signed with Eastern Suburbs, they claimed that they cooked and ate the rabbit. So Ron Coote knew exactly where he stood when he signed for Eastern Suburbs. And also Eastern Suburbs signed a couple of other players from South, most notably Elwood Walters, who went on to win 2 premierships with Eastern Suburbs in 1974-1975. So we go forward a few years in the future. Both clubs went on a period of decline on the field. South Sydney obviously weren't that great. Eastern Suburbs were kind of on the decline as well. One of the nicknames that they were known as in the 1980s and 90s was the Transit Lounge. But in terms of this rivalry, South reached their lowest ever point as a club, and it was at the hands of Eastern Suburbs in 1996 on Anzac Day, no less. Eastern Suburbs beat South Sydney 62 points to 0 in absolute humiliation. Then when South Sydney were controversially kicked out of the competition in 1999, Eastern Suburbs signed one of South Sydney's best prospects and probably was going to be one of their future greats, and Craig Wing. He ended up having a successful career with Eastern Suburbs. When South Sydney were finally readmitted back to the competition in 2002, their first match back in round 1 was against Eastern Suburbs at the Sydney Football Stadium, and Eastern Suburbs won that match 40 points to 6. So it was a tough initiation back to the NRL for South Sydney, and not a good look for a club, and especially against their arch rivals. Then the next year, Chris Walker, who had joined from Brisbane, signed with South Sydney, and only after 5 games he walked out on the club and signed with Eastern Suburbs. Now Chris Walker claims that after he did this, he got death threats in the mail. He got about 5 or 6 letters from people. He never proved who they were, but you'd have to guess that they were probably South Sydney supporters, and they threatened to kill Chris Walker for leaving South and going to East. Then, when Russell Crowe became involved with South and he took part ownership in the club, he started the Book of Feuds, which is, if you don't know, a book where he details every club and their rivalry or their history with South. But Russell Crowe had a very special chapter dedicated to Eastern Suburbs, which went for a few pages. And I'll read you a bit from the book which I've got, which says, and I quote, "There's no escaping the cold hard facts that South Sydney were formed before Eastern Suburbs have won more premierships than East Sydney City and Sydney Roosters combined, and have far more fans and better juniors." So that's from the opening pages of the rivalry with Eastern Suburbs, and you can kind of get the gist of where that's all going there. Like, so no love lost between Russell Crowe and Eastern Suburbs. Then we flash forward 2012. Now I'm pretty sure you've all seen this on NRL.com and you've seen it on Fox League. In this particular season, the two clubs met in I think it was either round 1 or one of the earlier rounds. Eastern Suburbs scored a final minute try through Anthony Minicello under the post. Eastern Suburbs went on to win that match. And then in the same year, South Sydney come from an improbable position to beat Eastern Suburbs at the Sydney Football Stadium, and it was the final try was scored by Adam Reynolds. And if you've listened to Warren Smith's commentary where he goes, "You can take me now, I've seen it all," that's that game. So if you've got some spare time, go and watch that match or the highlights, because it's one of the best finishes to a game I've ever seen. In 2014, South Sydney were back as Premiership contenders, and Eastern Suburbs were also defending premiers that year. They played each other in the final round of the regular season. The winner of that would go on to win the minor premiership. Eastern Suburbs easily accounted for South in that match, but in the same year, the two clubs met in the preliminary final, where South retained the fever. They beat Eastern Suburbs in that game to reach their first grand final since 1971. And it was also Anthony Minicello's final game as a Eastern Suburbs Sydney Roosters player. So South Sydney sent him out as a loser, which would have really stung Anthony Minicello. Flash forward to 2018, the two clubs met in the preliminary final at the Sydney Football Stadium, the final ever match at the Sydney Football Stadium, and it was also the biggest ever crowd on hand. It was a record crowd to watch both clubs go for a place in the grand final, and Eastern Suburbs won that match, and then they ended up winning the Premiership the next week. And just last year in 2019, the two clubs met each other again in the last round of the season. South Sydney bashed Eastern Suburbs. They won that match. They sent out a big message to East on the eve of the finals, but in week one of the finals, Eastern Suburbs easily accounted for South Sydney at the Sydney Cricket Ground, and they ended up going on to become back-to-back premiers, so they got the last laugh over South in that year. So that's 11 minutes I've gone for, and I've just crammed 112 years of history between the two clubs and all the big moments into one video. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please give it a like. If you really enjoyed it, please share it. If there's any Sydney Roosters, Eastern Suburbs, South Sydney fans out there that watch this video, share it with your friends and family. Get their thoughts on it. Get them involved. I'd love to hear your opinions on the videos and what I've said tonight. And also, if you've got a spare moment, go over to Facebook. I've got my page, Rugby League History. Go check that out. I'll put a link in the description below. But as always, look after yourselves, everyone. I'll catch you all later. Ta-ra.